Hit the subscribe button and activate the bell icon for more videos like this. It turns out someone drugged our drinks. I grabbed her hand and we basically just ran because it was kicking in so fast. What's the scariest, "this is how I die" moment you've been in? How did you survive? I was on the side of a cliff, taking pictures about 50 feet above the Alaskan highway from Anchorage to Girdwood. The ground had a steep slope towards the edge of the cliff, and while slowly transversing I started to slide. I started moving towards the edge, and couldn't make myself stop. I had shimmied over into a batch of shale, and had nothing solid to grasp, hence the sliding. I dug in as hard as I could, which tore up my palms. This did nothing. I realized that I was going to die. There was nothing else to do. I was going to slip right over the edge, and drop 50 feet onto the highway below. It created an ice cold knot in my stomach, yet I managed to stay calm. To this day I am stunned at how relaxed I was as I faced my death. At the last second, and I mean the last, my left foot found a stone sticking out of the dirt under the sliding shale. I caught my slide, and I managed to stop myself. The shale I was on slid right over the edge, leaving me trembling, holding my weight on one foot. If that rock hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here. That's all there is to it. My fiancé and I were driving down the interstate. He was driving, I was a passenger. We were behind a big semi with a flatbed with various machinery on it. Suddenly, a large piece of metal comes flying off the semi's bed at our car. I screamed. It was headed straight for the windshield. I literally thought, this is it. Just long enough to feel the car swerve. It was such a close call that it still scratched the car, but otherwise would have gone straight into our windshield. When I regained composure I told my fiancé, "Good job. Good job back there." And he, still quite shaken, said, "Thanks. I trained for that in video games." A buddy and I were hiking in China when we saw a hole through a mountain cliff where you could see clear through the mountain to the other side. It didn't look too far, so we thought, what the hell, let's go for it. An hour later we are several hundred feet up the steep mountain, barely keeping on our feet. It was seriously steep and the ground was wet and crumbling beneath our feet. We were too freaked out to head down, so we kept going up. At one point I was stuck. No handholds equals no way up. I decided to jump up and grab a sapling to pull myself further up. I jump, grab the small tree, and it pulls right out of the loose soil. I am falling backwards, tree in hand, and time is going in slow-mo. My thought was, well, this is how I die. As I topple backwards, my buddy who was above me moves with crazy speed and reaches down and grabs my wrist. Crisis averted. Suddenly we hear applause. Apparently the villagers were watching us the whole time and saw me almost die. They cheered, clapped, and motioned for us to keep going. Eventually we made it to the hole through the cliff, shaking like crazy. They set off firecrackers to celebrate our not dying. In West London years ago, I was at a club with a group of friends, one of whom had a habit of saying the worst thing to the scariest person at any given time. We were just leaving the nightclub when I looked behind me to see where he'd got to, when suddenly the bouncer shoved him out of the club and slammed the door. Thinking he'd done the usual and pissed off the doorman, I was about to give him shit, when I turned around and realized there were two men with sawed-off shotguns pointed at us. I froze momentarily, until another of our friends screamed, "Run," and we took off. As we ran, I had this clarity that at any second a bullet could rip through my back. I thought of my family. I sort of calmly imagined the aftermath of our deaths, that someone would have to call someone. Suddenly someone shouted stop, and I thought F that until I looked to my right, and as God is my witness, the gunmen were running alongside us. Seeing the fear in my 18-year-old female face, he cheerily said, in a voice I will never forget, "It's all right, darlin'. We're not after you." I had a mid-air collision with another skydiver and broke my neck when I hit the ground. Spinal shock started to set in, gradually paralyzing my diaphragm, making breathing next to impossible. I was able to direct my own rescue breathing by giving instructions, "Pinch my nose," to my jump partner who had come to my rescue. As I slowly lost consciousness, I thought that this must be what death was like and that it wasn't so bad. Unfortunately, I did wake up later in the hospital as a quadriplegic. I can't say that I was very scared while it was happening, but in retrospect it should have been terrifying. I gave an interview to Sunrise in Australia, the equivalent of the Today Show in America. A few weeks ago, I was fishing in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina. I was fishing in the ocean about 400 yards from the beach and it was low tide. There were no waves and I was fishing up against a rock jetty, so I didn't have my life jacket on. All of a sudden, a 7-foot shark took my bait and came straight to the surface. He jumped about 20 feet from my kayak and was headed towards me. The line had snapped by now, but he kept jumping. He came back up about 8 feet from my kayak and was flying through the air towards me. He landed about 4 feet from the kayak and dove under me. The moment from when he jumped the second time to when he dove under my kayak, all I was thinking was how I was going to get help when the shark hit me. I wasn't scared that he would bite me. I was scared that when that 150-pound missile hit me, he would crack my ribs and I was fall in the water. Luckily that didn't happen, and I just ended up with a raspy voice from screaming obscenities the whole way back to shore. When I was 17, I found out that I have a congenital heart defect one day when my heart quit beating. I felt my heart speed up, followed by intense pain and then nothing. I came to on the ground with my younger sister punching me in the chest and screaming, which is also how I survived. She didn't know CPR, so she just hit me in the chest as hard as she could, and fortunately that made the valve that closed pop right open and get back to work again. The doctor at the hospital said she did exactly the right thing. It was a matter of minutes from when I started feeling the pain to when I came to again, but I knew what was happening and I was absolutely terrified, both for myself and my little sister. We're both in our 30s now and she'll occasionally thump me one just in case. Maybe not the scariest, but memorable. For several weeks in the fall of 1963 my mother was a patient in the Big Air Force General Hospital at Lackland AFB in San Antonio, Texas. She had a private room near the top floor. The big window looked out over Medina Base, the atomic weapons storage facility. I was standing looking out the window at the sunset when a tremendous explosion sent up a mushroom cloud. The shock wave rocked the building several inches. My thought, well, I guess this is it. Turned out to be an accident with conventional explosives. Story time. I can't go into details because of an ongoing criminal case. I'm a lay minister in my church. We help make sure that families' needs are met and make sure that if there are any concerns we as a church we can help with. Parent lost their job? Let's help them find one and make sure there's still food on the table. Mom sick? Let's send over a couple of meals and make sure the kids are looked after so mom can rest. That kind of stuff. This time, though, the call for help was dire. We had been working with a young family, Jen and John, names changed, and helping them through a rough spot. John just got out of prison and we found him work as a handyman, even providing a tool set out of all our garages. I took him to parole meetings, showed him how to tie a tie, and we helped with the arrival of their daughter, born 4 days after his release. But John had a problem, and that problem was drugs. Using and selling. He wasn't very good at either. He stayed clean for a month before he fell back into the old life and it began to destroy him. One Sunday at church we got a text from Jen. John was high and wouldn't let her take the baby. He claimed to have a gun and wouldn't let Jen leave with the baby. She was at the store down the street and had contacted her mother to pick them up, but she needed help. This man had sat at my table, ridden in my car. I showed him how to fill out a W-2 and how to remove rusted hardware without damaging cabinets. He was my friend. I figured I could help defuse the situation, but I was wrong. I got to the house with another minister from church. He hung back and I went to the door. I could immediately see that John was glassy, twitchy, and erratic. Jen said he'd been using meth, but that really didn't resonate with me. The man I saw was not my friend. This wasn't John, this was a thug, a felon, a criminal. I told him we were there for the baby, that police would come soon, and he needed to leave before he got his parole revoked. He was in violation of a restraining order. He'd beaten Jen a week prior but she forgave him and took him back. He had drugs on him, and Jen had seen a gun. Nate, I don't care about no cops, man. They ain't gonna take me alive. He put his hand on his hip. Was it under his shirt? In his waistband? I couldn't tell. The baby was 10 feet inside the apartment, in a stroller. I wasn't sure where he was taking a 6-week-old in his state, but seeing her there next to a man out of his mind made me boil with a cold rage. He looked at Jen. You think you're safe? I'll deal with you when he's leave. He turned back to me, daring me with his wild, unfocused eyes. I took a deep breath and said a prayer. John, we're taking the baby. It's time to go. 3 steps in and I picked the baby out of the stroller and turned my back on him. Something about not showing fear? Not really. I'm a big guy and if things went wrong my body would protect the baby. He actually took a step back as I approached and drew his hand back. Nate, I've got a gun. If you take my daughter I'll kill you. I stopped, turned my head to look at him, and said with what witnessed was a big scary growl, I swear to the God of heaven, if you try to kill me, I will send you to hell first." That seemed to give him pause, for which I was grateful, because I had no idea how I'd make good on the threat if he pulled the trigger. I walked straight to the car and buckled in the baby. It seemed like I took 2 steps and covered the 100 yards distance. Jen was gathering things from the house, diapers, clothes, etc. "He's got my iPad," she complained as her mother started the car. "He's got a gun too, now the hell out of here before he decides to use it," was all I could muster. I warned him again that police would be arriving and he should leave. He pulled off his shirt to show his tattoos and said, "Nate, I told you. I ain't afraid of no cops. They ain't taking me alive." My heart sank as he repeated those words because I knew what they meant. We phoned the sheriff's department and let them know the assailant has expressed indifference to law enforcement, presented arms, and has declared he will not be taken alive. We found out 5 hours later after he surrendered to SWAT that this gun was a fake. I go to testify again in 2 weeks. We had a preliminary, and while I don't doubt he's sorry, I can't help but think what might have happened if the gun had been real. I had nightmares for a while, and then around the trial they came back. I don't remember all the questions, but I remember the defense was trying to prove that I wasn't scared of the threat if I went in anyway, that it wasn't credible. The DA on redirect asked me, "Him, were you afraid?" Me, "Yes." Him, "That he'd kill you?" Me, "Yes." Him, "And the baby? Were you afraid for her? For her mother?" Me, "Yes." Him, "Who were you most afraid for?" Me, "The baby." Him, "But why go in then?" Me, "I was too scared for her to be afraid for myself." Him, "No further questions." A few years ago I was rafting the upper portion of the Gauley in West Virginia. If you are unfamiliar with the upper Gauley, it is the best whitewater on the East Coast and in the top 10 runs in the world. We had scheduled our trip to coincide with Gauley season, which is when the West Virginia Corps of Engineers does scheduled dam releases to up the amount of water flowing through the gorge. On our second Class 5 rapid, on a scale from 1 to 5, of the day, Pillow Rock, our guide messed up and we dropped into a hole head-on, instead of sideways as is the conventional wisdom, rightfully so. All 3 of us on the left side of the raft got dumped. The guide was able to lunge across the boat and grab the girl in the back by her PFD, and he held her next to the raft for the rest of the rapid. The woman in the middle was able to grab onto a strap that ran along the side of the raft, and rode out the remainder of the rapid mostly under the raft but at least attached to it. I was in the front and have no memory of falling out. I remember being in the boat, but the next thing I remember is being underwater and getting pulled down so hard and so fast that my helmet's buckle was unclipped. I then spent a fair amount of time spinning underwater and making friends with a good number of rocks. At that point, I wasn't so much trying to swim as I was protecting my head. The spinning slowed and I was able to find purchase with both feet and kicked off hard towards what I assumed was the surface. I was very short on breath since I hadn't taken a large gulp of air before getting sucked under. So I was close to losing it, but could tell that I was getting close to the surface based on the amount of light I could make out in the lessening pressure. I kept my panic in check up until the point that my hands and face made contact with the bottom of the raft. Of all the places I could have chosen to come up for air, of course I tried to occupy the same space as the only other thing on the surface of the river. I lost it for a second or two, but as things started to get blurry I used my hands to walk myself out from under the raft. As my mouth and nose breached the surface, I took the biggest breath and wiped my face only to see I was headed directly for the massive undercut rock our guide had warned us about before we entered the rapid. A couple of cameramen on said rock were frantically gesturing to me that I should do everything in my power to avoid it at all costs. I side-stroked as hard as I could, but it wasn't enough. I got my feet downstream of me and laid as flat as I could on the surface of the water. I caught the rock with my feet and could immediately feel the current trying to force me into more of a seated position, that I imagined would have ultimately led to me going back under. Maintaining my flat position, I was able to bounce myself off the rock a few times with my feet, each time moving myself further and further to the left edge of the rock. On the 4th push-off I was able to side-stroke around the edge of the rock and could see my boat downstream, now out of the rapid. They were just pulling in the woman who had managed to ride it out hanging onto the strap. They had gotten her back on board by the time I reached them, and they were able to pull me back in. Motorcycle accident. I was out riding around 9 in the evening and came to an intersection. As I was crossing, a girl that I was told by a car behind me was texting, and took a left turn straight into me. The moment I saw her starting to turn and there was nothing I could do, I just took a breath, lifted my feet up, winced, and a split second later she hit me. The impact crushed my foot between the car bumper and the bike. If I had left my foot down, she would have demolished my leg. She hit me so hard that the swing arm was broken in half. I landed on asphalt and rolled 2 or 3 times. I was wearing my helmet, boots, and an armored vest over my shirt. The helmet saved my life. Hitting the ground that hard would have turned my brain into jello. I couldn't believe I was alive, and managed to lift my visor and start barking directions to the people running up. You call 911. You, my mom's number is etc. You, hold my hand. And you get that girl away from me. The girl who hit me had run over to yell at me while I was on the ground. She was treated roughly by the people around me, and they kept her at the scene until cops and the ambulance arrived. The foot was broken in 8 places, I had a few bruises and a scratch or 2, and a bad reaction to the Dilaudid they gave me was all I suffered. That was about 4 or 5 years ago now, but I still can't wear high heels like I used to, and it aches randomly and is visibly a little swollen in comparison to my other foot. I went skiing once when I was around 9 years old. It was a field trip with my school. I had gone skiing before, so I was alright, but one of the slopes had a big ramp at the bottom that you could jump off of. All the cool kids jumped off it no problem, but I was scared. Eventually I decided I just had to man up and do it, because I didn't want people thinking I was a wimp. Well, I figured the best thing to do was to just lean in and do it, so I went straight down the slope and kept catching more and more speed. I went off the ramp like a bullet, just shot way up in the air, like ridiculously far, and I remember thinking, well, I guess that's that, I'm dead now. I hit the ground, and to my surprise I wasn't crushed into a pulp, but I still thought I was going to die because I landed on my back and couldn't breathe at all. People who had seen me came running to help, and eventually I recovered somewhat. For the rest of the trip my nose kept dripping snot mixed with blood though, and whenever I had to breathe in it hurt like hell. Everyone saw I wasn't a pussy though. I jumped farther off the ramp than the rest of the class combined. Some years ago, I was near the end of my studies at college, and I was on my way up to an interview in a city about 100 miles away. It was all interstate highway and it was raining pretty hard. Silly college student Dan Mising decided that he could stretch his nearly bald tires out just a little longer and keep using them. I was doing about 70 miles per hour when I reached a pretty big curve in the road. My car began to spin out of control, and the anti-lock braking lights started flashing. I panicked, smashed the hazard lights button in the center of my dashboard, "Good job, Hyundai," and started pumping my brakes and tapping the handbrake. I made 2 full spins, and a little more than half of a third turn, and actually kept my car on the road. This is when it got scary. I was horrified to see in front of me a semi-truck with 2 trailers attached to it coming straight at me in the lane I was in. At the very last second he changed lanes and laid on his horn, but he missed me. I thought I had one of those brief "this is your life flashing before your eyes" moments when the adrenaline really kicked in. The rest of traffic stopped and I restarted my engine that had stalled out. I got over onto the right shoulder of the road and white-knuckled my way forward. I was only doing about 30 miles per hour for the next 10 miles or so, still on the shoulder with my hazard lights flashing. I made it to the interview on time, but was still a little traumatized. I still get nervous when I drive in the rain, but I replace my tires well ahead of schedule now. Got caught in an ocean riptide, and was clueless as to how to get away from one then. Just as my arms became completely exhausted from struggling to get back into the beach and my head started to go under, something popped into my brain. People float. I immediately put my legs up and turned on my back, and when I regained some arm strength, I would push when a wave came in until I could finally put my feet down and walk. After I made it in, I dragged my exhausted frame over to the poolside bar at our hotel, had 2 shots of tequila, went up to her room and cried like a baby. My, now ex-wife had no idea until later how much trouble I was in out there. When I was 11, my mom was driving my sister, my brother and I, and we got into a car accident. Driving over a hill, we swiped the side of a car coming over the other side, which made my mom lose control of the car. We ended up upside down in a cow pasture, hanging from our seatbelts, but then the car started smoking. My brother was only a few months old, so I was able to unbuckle him and hand him to my mom before the van caught on fire. I never really thought about death in the moment, I just wanted to save my brother. About 2 years ago I was in New Orleans visiting a friend. We went to dinner and decided to grab some drinks because New Orleans. We went to a bar on Bourbon Street and each got a beer. A bit of background. My friend and I are both older 20-something females, promised to look out for each other, and up to this point had 1 drink at dinner. This was at about 8 p.m. on a Thursday if my memory serves me. About an hour and 2 beers later I knew something was wrong. I'm not a crazy drinker by any means, but I felt like something has really making me feel way too drunk. Things were starting to go dark and fuzzy. I told my friend and it was obvious that she was dealing with the same thing. It turns out someone drugged our drinks. I grabbed her hand and we basically just ran because it was kicking in so fast that I knew we didn't have much time before we were totally out of it. Unfortunately, there were some guys that took off after us. I'm assuming it was the guys who drugged our drinks. One of the guys grabbed me and I fell and smashed my head on the side of a building. Luckily, my friend got away. So I'm laying on the ground, bleeding, and I seriously thought, this is it. Rape, torture, murder, who knows? The last thing I remember from that night is seeing some good Samaritan couple pulling the guys away and the woman telling me to stay with her. Obviously, I wouldn't have survived without those people's help. And the people at the hospital. The wound was so big that it would have caused me to bleed out if they hadn't been there to get me help. No one ever caught the guys and my friend ended up making it to our hotel and had no idea about anything. The last thing she remembers was running and getting into a cab. I still have a massive scar on my head, but I also have long hair so you can't see it. The lady who does my hair always comments on it though. I never told her the real story because, well, it's just easier to say car accident to someone who, no offense to hairstylists as a whole, gossips non-stop with coworkers and other clients. Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more videos like this. And please share your own near-death story in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button and activate the bell icon for more videos like this. Let us know in the comments what you think about these stories.